Good morning, and thank you for joining us here today for AIM's 2022 Pink Slip event, Bridging the Workplace Gender Gap. I'm Brooke Thompson, Executive Vice President of Government Affairs at AIM, and I will be moderating today's webinar. It is an honor and a pleasure to have with us today Massachusetts Congresswoman Katherine Clark. Congresswoman from the 5th District and Assistant Speaker of the 117th Congress. Congresswoman Clark is a vocal advocate for ending wage discrimination, protecting women's health, access to affordable, high-quality childcare, paid family leave, and safer schools, amongst other reforms. And there is no better keynote who could be with us here today to share what her office and Congress are working on in the area of advancing women in the workforce. She is also my Congresswoman and a friend. Little known fact, we had a little bit of crossover in the AG's office, and it was a fantastic opportunity to work with her. We look forward to her sharing her efforts with us today so that we can ensure that businesses who are AIM members are working alongside policymakers to advance women in the economy. Before we get started, I want to just review a few housekeeping issues. We will not be doing a live Q&A here today, but if you do have questions, if you look over, it's probably on the right side of your screen, there's a little question pane. You can type your questions or comments in there and click send. Those will get to our team. We will try to respond to them. If there is time to add them to the panel conversation, we will try to do so. And of course, if you're having any technical issues during the presentation, please reach out to Sarah Rutkowski. Her email is right there, and she will help you navigate whatever the issue might be. Lastly, we're going to cover a lot of information in the next 60 minutes. If you do need to reach out after today's webinar, you can call our employer hotline if you're a member. If you're not a member, at the end of the presentation, I will give you information about how you can sign up. And with that, let's dive right in. I am thrilled to introduce today's primary sponsor of our Pink Slip event, Katie Joyce of Alkermes. Katie Joyce is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Alkermes, a biopharma company focused on developing treatments for people living with addiction, serious mental illness, and cancer. At Alkermes, Katie leads the team responsible for both internal and external product, R&D, and corporate communications, as well as social responsibility and patient advocacy. Prior to joining Alkermes, Katie held various corporate affairs and communications roles at Takeda and Shire. And before joining the private sector, she spent a majority of her career in politics in both Massachusetts and in Washington, D.C., most recently working for Governor Deval Patrick and Lieutenant Governor Tim Murray. Katie is currently a member of the Massachusetts Business Coalition for Early Childhood Education and on the board of the Mass Business Roundtable. Previously, Katie served on the Mass Board of Early Education and Care, the Governor's Task Force on Women and Work, and the chair of a local political action committee dedicated to supporting candidates and policies that promote strong schools, high-quality public services, and an inclusive community. Katie, thank you for being here today, and I'll turn the floor over to you to introduce the Congresswoman.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I'm thrilled to be here. And good morning to everybody on today's webinar. We're so happy at Alkermes to highlight the great work that AIM is doing to focus on the issue of gender equity and strengthening the Massachusetts economy. And most of all, here to introduce the Congresswoman. It's a privilege to kick off this event today and introduce a policymaker focused on ensuring Massachusetts is a place where businesses and families can thrive. We at Alkermes share this commitment. Congresswoman Katherine Clark proudly serves the 5th District of Massachusetts. She was first elected in the special election in December of 2013. Katherine's career in public service is driven by her commitment to helping children and families succeed. And as Brooke mentioned, Congresswoman Clark is a vocal advocate for ending wage discrimination, protecting women's health care, access to affordable, high-quality childcare, paid family leave, safer schools, and so many other reforms to address the challenges women and families face. She believes that Congress must work to end the glaring disconnect between the needs of families at home and priorities in Washington. In Congress, Katherine brings her experience as a state senator, state representative, and general counsel for the Massachusetts Office of Child Care Services, and as the policy chief for the state attorney general. Katherine represents a diverse district comprised of 24 cities and towns that stretch from the coastal communities of Revere and Winthrop through the economic engine of Metro West. In the fall of 2020, Katherine was elected by her colleagues to serve as Assistant Speaker of the 117th Congress after serving as the Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus during the previous session. Additionally, she serves as a member of the steering and policy committees within the caucus. Katherine is a member of the U.S. House Committee on Appropriations and 3 subcommittees within Appropriations: Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies, the Legislative Branch, and Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and Related Agencies. Katherine's a proud member of several caucuses, including the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Women's Caucus. She lives in Revere with her husband, Rodney, and they have 3 children, Addison, Riley, and Nathaniel. It's my pleasure to turn this over to my Congresswoman and an amazing female leader, Congresswoman Katherine Clark. Katherine?
Oh, thank you so much, Brooke and Katie, and good morning to everyone. It is truly an honor to join you for AIM's International Women's Day event, and truly a pleasure to be with such longtime friends and women leaders. And speaking of leaders, for years, AIM has been at the forefront of our business community in Massachusetts, ensuring that our Commonwealth and our economy succeed today and will thrive tomorrow. And so today we are gathered to talk about a central pillar of that success, and that, of course, is women. Women are the backbone of our economy. They are our essential workers and the unsung heroes of our recovery. Women have always been leaders who have pushed America forward. As Manaz Afghani, an Iranian-American human rights activist, said, the connection between women's human rights, gender equality, economic development, and peace is increasingly apparent. This Women's History Month finds us in a time of war, pandemic, rising wealth disparities, and economic anxiety. It is not only more appropriate than ever that we work towards equality for women, but it is an imperative. And we have some work to do. I understand what it means to be a woman in a male-dominated space. Like so many of you in this room, the fight for representation and equity is personal. It's also a struggle women can relate to in any industry, from the boardroom to small businesses to the halls of Congress. Never has this been more true than right now as we recover from the pandemic and its economic fallout. The pandemic pulled back the curtain on systemic inequities built into our economy. Despite our strong recovery facilitated by President Biden and congressional Democrats, 7 million jobs are being created. Unemployment is the lowest since the 1960s and the fastest economic growth in nearly 4 decades. But too many women are not feeling the effects. Since February of 2020, women in the US have lost almost 5.5 million jobs. And in January alone, women accounted for 80% of US adults who stopped working or looking for work. Women have borne the brunt of the economic crisis brought on by this pandemic because we have failed to build an economy that respects and values women's work. More than 5 decades after the passage of the Equal Pay Act, women still make only 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. And that gap is even wider for women of color. Our economy has always been built on the backs of unpaid or poorly paid women. And the inaccessibility of paid family leave and affordable childcare and elder care has prevented women from entering, staying, and excelling in the workforce. These inequities have created what we call the she-cession. The pandemic has been especially hard for women of color. While overall unemployment is down to 3.8%, unemployment for Latinas is higher, and unemployment for Black women has risen to a staggering 6.1%. So that's where we stand. Let's talk about where we go from here. Right now, we have a historic number of women leaders in Washington and here in the Commonwealth. And we have one goal: building an economy that works for us all. First, we have to deliver equal pay for equal work. Not only is it fair, but women direct 83% of all consumption in the US. Equal pay is fundamental to building a robust and just economy. Two, let's make sure that workplaces are safe for everyone. No woman or worker should fear sexual harassment or assault anywhere, especially on the job. Just a few weeks ago, President Biden signed a new law that voids forced arbitration agreements in the cases of sexual assault and harassment. And I've introduced legislation to prevent workplace harassment and ensure survivors can seek accountability and justice. We can retain women workers across industries if we are sure they will be protected, respected, and heard. And third, we have to make childcare affordable and accessible to every family. I am sure millions of women across this country saw themselves in the testimony of Judge Jackson when she spoke of the challenges of being a mom and having a legal career. When I was first elected to Congress, I had 3 children and 2 very sick parents. I was juggling care for them while flying back and forth from Washington. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I had a supportive spouse and the resources to pay for help. But still, I felt like I was failing someone every day. And for most moms, this is beyond balancing careers and family life. It is childcare that allows them to go to work and provide the necessities for their families. Even before the pandemic, the childcare system was at a breaking point. 1 in 3 families struggling to find childcare, the cost of care equaling a month's rent or mortgage, too many families living in childcare deserts, unable to access care at all, and home care that was eating up a family's entire savings. Every year, we leave $57 billion in economic potential on the table because of lack of affordable childcare. Think about that. And then the pandemic blew the whole system apart. Democrats have responded by taking a historic step forward with the American Rescue Plan, which provided $40 billion in child care relief funding. This money supported child care providers and educators, 96% of whom are women and most of whom are women of color. These women average $12 an hour for providing not only the nurturing educational care for our children, but vital economic infrastructure. If we want an economy that works for everyone, we have to start by investing in childcare. We are in a moment of incredible progress. Women are claiming their power, making their voices heard, and speaking up about the realities of being a woman in our economy. And importantly, we're changing the conversation around the care economy, around paid leave, taking childcare and home care from issues of personal choice and responsibility to public goods that make up an essential element of our economic infrastructure. We aren't sitting on the sidelines. We're demanding a better, more just America as we recover and rebuild from COVID. And you, our business community here in the Commonwealth, and especially our female leaders, play a central role in this work. The funding we secured through the American Rescue Plan wouldn't have been possible without the support of business leaders, including many of you right here in Massachusetts. I am so grateful to be your partner in Washington as we work to continue improving workforce participation, providing affordable quality care to working moms, and bridging the workplace gender gap. Please continue to speak out and stand up on behalf of women in our economy. I thank you for having me. I thank you for your friendship and your partnership. Happy Women's History Month, and I hope you enjoy the incredible panel to follow.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for those amazing remarks and for taking the time to be here with us today. We are eternally grateful for your public service and your leadership on this. And as you said, we consider you a partner with us, with business, as we continue to try to navigate these, because we know both business and policymakers have to be at the same table. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Brooke.
So now we're going to shift to our panel discussion. Our panel is going to respond to the Congresswoman's remarks and share their own experiences. And let me tell you how thrilled I am to have this fantastic group of female leaders with us here today. I'm going to start by introducing the rest of our panel. You already heard me give the fantastic background of Katie Joyce from Alkermes, who is going to be part of our discussion. Nerys Camargo, who is the Massachusetts Cannabis Commissioner, is a leader in the community and in political organizing in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She has dedicated her career to forging opportunities and across the Commonwealth and access for communities of color. In 2011, she founded the Chica Project, a nonprofit dedicated to closing the opportunity divide for young Latinas and other women of color by empowering them with skills and tools necessary to thrive personally and professionally. For more than 20 years, she has served as an advisor and strategist to local, statewide, and congressional campaigns for women and candidates of color. And prior to her appointment in December of 2020 to the Cannabis Control Commission, Nerys led statewide municipal, legislative, and community affairs for AT&T as the Regional Director of External Affairs for Massachusetts and Rhode Island. In addition, we have Pam Everhart, the Senior Vice President and Head of Regional Public Affairs and Community Relations at Fidelity Investments. As a 26-year Fidelity Investment veteran with financial service expertise, she is a leader in her field. In this role, Pam oversees the firm's state and local government relationships, public affairs, and community relations activities at its Boston headquarters and across facilities, across the country. Pamela has led Fidelity's efforts to deliver financial literacy to hundreds of thousands of students in underserved communities in the regions where Fidelity has a footprint. As a leader in the community, Pamela is one of the 19 Massachusetts Black and Brown executives who launched the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund to help drive transformative social changes and address systematic racism and racial inequality, and was appointed by Boston Mayor Marty Walsh to the steering committee of the Boston Racial Equity Fund. We also have Mayor Nicole LaChapelle of East Hampton, Massachusetts. The mayor was first elected in 2017 and has served as a steady hand to weather the crisis of COVID-19. Through her leadership, East Hampton has received a record amount of grants and investments in the city's roads, open spaces, housing, business community, and transportation. Nicole spent over 2 decades with the Center for School Crisis Intervention and Assessment, serving as a senior strategist and administrator for public school students with a wide range of behavioral and physical capabilities. She was appointed to director of the organization in 2008, and she left in 2016 and went on to serve as chief of pupil services for the Holyoke Public Schools, overseeing district special education services and related compliance functions. Nicole also served on the boards of the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts, Emerge Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Association of Approved 766 Private Schools, and in 2011, she was honored as an unsung heroine by the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women. I'm also proud to say that the mayor is a fellow Women's College graduate. She went to Smith, I went to Mount Holyoke, so we have that 5 college connection as well. Thank you, ladies, for all being here today. We're thrilled to have you. So with those introductions out of the way, I want to jump right into our panel discussion. And I'm going to try to break this down by topics. I know there's a lot to cover. Certainly, the Congresswoman kicked us off. And, you know, the first thing she talked about was childcare as infrastructure, and really the importance of childcare for women in the workforce and the economy as a whole. The collapse of the childcare industry as a result of COVID-19 has hit women disproportionately hard, as the Congresswoman said. Childcare sector has seen 60% of its programs closed at the height of the pandemic, before rebounding slightly, but still down nationwide some almost 240,000 workers. Some projections show the industry could permanently lose half of its programs. A new survey from Goldman Sachs found that the lack of access to childcare is the primary issue holding back small businesses across the US. Over half of small business owners said they or their employees have dealt with childcare challenges during the pandemic. And 80% of small business owners support Congress taking action to increase access to affordable childcare. Following the Congresswoman's remarks on the need for childcare to be recognized as infrastructure and an essential aspect of rebuilding the state and national economies to bring people back to work, do you agree that more funding is necessary to provide sufficient childcare options for employers, and why? And is funding the only issue we should be looking at here? I'm going to open this up. I'd like all panelists to respond. So, Katie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Brooke. I think clearly that funding is absolutely needed, but a point that the Congresswoman made is worth reiterating, that before the pandemic, the child care system was broken in so many ways. People couldn't find care, people couldn't afford care, and that has to be worked on globally. One other part that I think is important is we aren't just talking about 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or 8 to 6. What about our colleagues and our neighbors and our family members who are working shift jobs? They're in a manufacturing plant. They might be a healthcare worker. There's a long list of different needs that people have for timing. And I really hope that as we look at rebuilding childcare infrastructure, we take a much broader view than was taken initially and make sure that there is that coverage so that people can go back to work. And again, not just thinking about the 9 to 5, I recognize how fortunate many of us are who are able to work from home, and yet it was still challenging. I can't imagine what it was like for people who were struggling with, who had to go into the office. But looking at those different hours and that entire infrastructure, I think is very, very important as we go forward.
Thank you, Katie. Pam, do you have thoughts on the issue of childcare funding and the work Congress can do?
Yes, absolutely. We all know that millions of families rely on childcare in order to work. And without access to affordable care, many parents can't earn a living that enables them to provide for their families. And I think businesses will be challenged to recruit from a broad spectrum of all available top talent if you have people who can't enter the workplace because of lack of childcare. And one thing that we hadn't talked about with early childcare, kids get an opportunity to start to learn early. So those educational opportunities for kids are important. So for us, from a business perspective, I think it is imperative that employers think about the best way to support the well-being of their employees. And we've started to do things like that at Fidelity, not only child care, but elder care is really important. I have an aging mother and father right now, and I'm actually going through that and just trying to figure out the resources. So that's something else that employers can do, like medical, financial, just emotional resources. How do you look for a child care provider or an elderly care provider? How do you interview for them? How do you do the background checks? All of those are important pieces. And for us, it's not just mothers. We know there are working fathers who are also concerned about childcare. So enhanced parental leave for all parents are important. And for those that are non-birthing parents of newborns, we can't forget about those, and those associates in your firms who welcome children through adoption. So I think all of those things should be addressed. Employers have a keen an important role to play. And it's not just about the funding, it's actually having conversations and understanding what people need. And one other thing I'll just mention before I close is that at Fidelity, what we tried to do in the summer when kids are now back at home, or even during the school year when they were home, how do you keep those kids engaged while we're trying to work? So we launched some virtual kids camps during school breaks, some during the pandemic, where we provided activities like art lessons virtually. We did some celebrity chef demos and fitness classes and all of those things, because it's really family care where you actually meet the needs of all people in the family.
Thank you, Pam. That's fantastic. And it's a good segue for Nerys, who I know through her nonprofit works with youth all the time. So Nerys, what are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you. It's so nice to be here this morning. While I heard the Congresswoman, I just have to say it was so nice to hear her and just be inspired. And it made me think about Encanto, right? Disney's Encanto and Luisa. If you guys all know the character of Luisa, you know, she's this tough Colombiana who can pick up 4 donkeys with 1 arm, right? And I feel like when the Congresswoman was speaking, I feel like all of us have a little bit of Luisa in us, right? So I wanted to definitely share that because it's just so timely. But you know, when it comes, Pam, you mentioned something around employee engagement. So I've been at the Cannabis Control Commission now about 13, 14 months. And I think one of the things that, you know, there's a lot of us who plan and are writing policies and are advocating, but I think the most important thing is to really think about, what do our employees need? Ask them. Figure out your employee engagement surveys, right? Don't be afraid. I've sort of said something to our executive director at the Cannabis Control Commission, Sean Collins. I'm like, we need to probably think about pod parties, right? How do we re-engage again? How do we bring family together? But in terms of youth and the aspect of some of our young folks out there, and the work that Chica Project is doing, they've been doing a lot of work around mental health. The pandemic, I don't know, you know, I don't have biological kids of myself, but I have a lot of kids that I mentor and I guide and I take care of, and the openness that they've had throughout the pandemic to talk about mental health is not what I saw 5 or 10 years ago. I think, you know, young folks are now really open to have discussion around mental health and what they need, but also what do their parents need. And I think some of the work that Chica Project has done, there's actually on the website, chicaproject.org, under news, there's a report that they released in 2020, just around the pandemic and some of the things that they saw with our young people. But I would say mental health has been key. And I think we have to figure out also as employers, how do we engage the parents or caretakers of some of these youth and children who, Pam, like you said, we need to create more spaces now for our young people to get engaged. So I'm excited to think about as a community, not just through my volunteer nonprofit work, but also at the commission, how do I support families and caretakers? I think somebody said it earlier, I am dealing with aging parents right now. They're my kids as we speak, and it's a lot, and no one prepares you for aging parents. So I just wanted to share those few comments and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Nerys. Mayor LaChapelle, so certainly running a municipality, but also just your work, you know, with children and with schools. I'm sure you have an interesting perspective on this.
So I would say, of course, more funding is needed. Yes. I mean, you know, more dollars, the merrier. And I have to give a lot of credit to Representative Clark. One, she is a consistent long-term champion of these issues. So when she's putting stuff forward, it's not because she just kind of found it on the side of her desk. And that is just such important advocacy. The other thing I give our delegation, our federal delegation too, is how we got federal money on the city level. So regardless of how big you were as a city or town, you got money directly. And so what that allowed me to do as a mayor is to do very micro, day by day interventions into childcare, work, health, and whatnot, because I had the flexibility of that money, while bigger systematic. solutions could be found. And what I would say here, I would urge, is the same. So we have this, we know what the solutions are. I mean, and we know what the gaps are. It's about, do we have the will to do them? And right now, I love the freedom and would like to see more of, allow the cities and towns work very directly with private employers as well as daycare centers and get them up and going and give them assistance, something like, a pay increases that don't take away any of the entitlements, either the childcare workers or those who need childcare. Have no late fees, whatnot. In the meanwhile, while working on that, and we can get funding locally to do those sort of things, let's pursue the legislation that Representative Clark and many others are putting forward in Congress, and my colleagues on this call have been advocating. I do think this is it's urgent. It always has been, but now it's glaring. This is not just a gap, it's a gleaming, and we need to kind of bifurcate our approach. The immediate urgent dollars need to support this industry, these families, employees, employers immediately, while we fix the problem we've known existed for decades.
Thank you. I think that's an important point. And certainly, you being situated on the ground, what programs are in your community, what employers need. And, it's an important thing to mention that there are different needs depending on where you are in the state, right? So certainly what's going on in your municipality might be very different than what's going on in another municipality. So I think that's a great perspective. So I always feel like sometimes when we break down these issues into our own personal experiences, we have a lot of things that can help sort of keep the conversation going, because we say, oh, well, this is something I dealt with, and it strikes something that has happened or is happening for somebody else that really gets them engaged. And so I'm hoping for a second question, we can really draw on some of you to share some of your own personal experiences when it came to juggling career and childcare. And sort of how that affected you, and what, if any, sort of long-term marks it left with respect to how you look at this issue. And I'll just sort of leave it open for whoever wants to take that first.
I can certainly jump in on this real quick. It kind of goes to what I last said. Especially after June 20th, the murder of George Floyd, but also the racial reckoning that is, maybe happening on mainstream media now, but has always been there, needed to be there. I look back on my career and I had direct and indirect nuanced privilege. My aunt's friend owned the daycare. If I was late because I had an opportunity to go out with drinks, my daughter was put in a car and she slept in Charlemont for the night, and she came back down. I used a PO box in Northampton so she could go to a kindergarten program in Northampton that had a bus to that daycare. We lived in East Hampton. I had my daughter come with me to work snow days and whatnot, and had multiple relatives who I could leave her with when I was sick. It was, I could say I'm very fortunate, but the bottom line is I wasn't fortunate. I was lucky, and I was white, and I was an attorney, and yada, yada, yada. But, I was dropping my daughter off at daycare in places where the women and men who were taking care of her did not have that. And so we chose my daughter's first grade to 8th grade school based on the fact that they didn't mark for being late, and there was no real attendance requirement because that worked for my work schedule. So, and that included my kid getting up at 7 o'clock being at her friend's house at 7 o'clock. The needs, I did a lot to make it work. And my takeaway from that is, I don't know, maybe my daughter, who's now 31's therapy bills, I'm not sure. We're gonna work it through in Ireland when we go next week. So
No, I appreciate that. I think that's an important perspective that certainly, I think some of us, depending on what side, can definitely understand your perspective, and maybe we've had similar perspectives.
Okay, I can add just a little bit to that as well. My husband and I are in Massachusetts with no immediate family. So with our two kids, it was really stressful trying to figure out who was going to take care of them and how to do it. And what I was trying to do, and I started off trying to do it all like a lot of women and all by myself. And then I realized what we should allow to do, where our husbands or our partners or whomever can take on some of that burden, allow them to do it, and then allow them to do it in the way in which they would do it. I mean, I was trying to be very directive at first in terms of how my husband would join in and help with the childcare. And then I realized he's doing it. So I don't need to be in control as long as it's getting done. And so I had to just let that go, give him the assignment, and have him do it. And then I negotiated with our childcare provider. I mean, I had the 6 o'clock thing that we had to pick up our child by 6 o'clock, and it wasn't working. And my husband said, "Oh my gosh, we're going to have all these fees." I said, "Let's negotiate with her. You know, use those skills that I learned in law school, and I negotiated, and we worked out a plan." So don't be afraid to ask, because you never know. People may be willing to help you out. So I just say, if people are there trying to help you, your spouse and others, get out of the way, let them do it, and then always try to negotiate.
I think that's great. And I think you bring up an important point, and you also addressed this in the previous answer. This is not, certainly it's important that all of us women are here having this conversation, but men have to be at the table too, right? And this notion, if we're going to break this notion that somehow childcare and or parent care is tied to being female, then we have to bring everybody to the table, right? And so that's parental leave and really opening and expanding that dialogue.
And Brooke, if I may add, I think that for someone who hasn't had biological kids, I think for me it was a good time, because a lot of my friends called me and said, "Nudies, can you watch somebody for me? Can you pick so-and-so up from school?" And it was like, great, because I get to pick them up and send them right back, right? But I think it allowed us to build community. And I think, Pam, to your point, right, sometimes we're so in control. And I think what I saw was that a lot of folks pick up the phone and just build community. Like, you get to know your neighbors a little more. Now your kid is hanging out, outside with your neighbor's kids or the kids out on the street. So for me, it was I do have a privilege, as well in terms of where I'm at and where I live and things like that. But it was just nice to see more community and folks really picking up the phone to say, "Hey, can you help me? Can you take care of my child?" I mean, I did Zoom events with kids while some of my friends were at work, because I had a little bit more flexibility during lunchtime, right? Or my coworker, brought their child in one day, and I sat down, at lunch with them while they, had a meeting. So I think it also provided for community. But I'll definitely say the aging parent situation is definitely something we have to keep in mind when we're trying to figure out what this looks like for the workforce development as well. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Nerys. Katie?
Pam, your comment about letting go of control really hit home. My husband, during the pandemic, for the first part, I was sort of in charge of the school and the Google Meets and everything else. And in September of 2020, I was like, "Okay, you're on." And he made a big deal, and he developed what he called Daddy Academy. He bought binders, he did all of these things. They never got full of anything, but I did have to just sort of step back and say, okay, it's not going to go the way that I want it to go, but it's going to go, and everybody is fine. They missed a couple classes here and there, but they also had a great time. The kids had a different experience with my spouse than they would have with me, and letting go of that control is important. I was just going to say, I think that the stress and anxiety around childcare, it's even when things are good, is very, very real. I had twins in 2010, and for the first 2 years of their lives, every single Sunday I'd sit down with my husband and we would say, "Okay, if somebody is sick on Monday, who's home? How about Tuesday? How about Wednesday?" All the way to Friday, because neither of us worked a full week those entire first 2 years. And Nerys probably knows that, because I wasn't in my office in the governor's office at that time. Because if your child's in childcare, they're always sick. Somebody is always getting sick. And I don't know that anybody noticed. I don't know that any of my employers actually thought it took away from my job, but the weight and the pressure that it put on me, and that I felt it was taking away from my job, was incredibly stressful. And I honestly didn't realize how stressful it was until the pandemic hit, where I wasn't worried about going into the office because I could do what I was doing from home. And that was an acceptable and obviously mandated thing to do. But it's changed my perspective as I work with a team at Alkermes, which is predominantly women and mothers and caretakers in one way or another, making sure it's very, very clear to people that they have that flexibility and that I don't want that to be an additional burden that they're thinking about. They have to take care of their families in order to be able to take care of their work. And that has to be clear and explicit to all of the team members.
Thank you, Katie. And that's a great point, right? So much we focus that clearly the glaring discrepancies in workplace and sort of the divide based on gender got amplified, or at least had a light shined on it by the pandemic, right? But to some extent, the pandemic has also brought opportunities, right, for employers to look at it differently and to take on this notion that I always hate, work-life balance, because I think it always presumes there is such a thing, but to try to look at it from a different lens about how maybe for parents or caregivers, you can provide some flexibility in certain industries, right, that allows some of these things that we've struggled with for so long to maybe, make some progress on those areas. So I think that's a great point. I want to shift a little bit to, another important piece of this, which is, and the Congresswoman addressed this, the racial disparities involved in the childcare industry, right? So we were all sort of giving this perspective, which makes sense, those of us as parents or who cared for somebody, what it's like to have to drop your kids off. But the fact is 93% of childcare workers are women and 45% are Black, Asian, or Latino, right? And the majority of them are small businesses and they're minority-owned businesses. So it's the flip side of, and all of this goes into everything we talked about, right? Access, the hours, all of these things, because for a lot of these folks who are working in this industry, they too have kids that they have to take care of, and that all butts up. So I guess I would ask maybe one or two of you, what do you think needs to be done to address the gaps within the industry itself? And what can policymakers do to be supportive to reduce these gaps that are really putting most of the burden on females and particularly minority females?
Brooke, I'll just start off. I think that's a really important question. And I'll just say that we started to look at Fidelity to support areas where underrepresented populations may feel a greater impact. And we did see that as a result of the pandemic. So for us, it was, what about if you can do this within your company, provide more flexible work options? I mean, this sense of 9 to 5, that's not working any longer. And so can you shift? Is it 6 to 3, right? Or is it 10 to 7? Or what can you do to make it easier on some of the underrepresented populations? And then we are offering a child care subsidy that will help pay or reimburse for child care expenses as a result of a lot of the disruptions that come about through the pandemic. And the other thing that going into 2020 as a result of the pandemic and the George Floyd murder, we saw the inequality and the disproportionate impact on communities of color. And we started then looking at nonprofit organizations. How can we then support those geniuses on the ground looking at these issues every day, right? And so that's another way that businesses can support people of color and support these organizations. And think about your community relations work and how can you be a better corporate citizen? Are you listening to these nonprofit leaders? What do they need? What resources? It's not all about the money. Right. Sometimes it's about the expertise that you may be able to provide. So those are some of the different things that we're looking at to support those workers of color, those workers who are in nonprofit organizations who are struggling because they don't always get the funding that the larger nonprofits get, and they're trying to solve some of these problems for people of color in their communities.
That's great. Thank you, Pam. Particularly the leadership fidelity shown is fantastic. Mayor, just wondered if you had a snapshot of either communities in your municipality or, needs of the childcare providers on the ground, or sort of what you've seen on this.
Really very similar to what Pam described. The 9 to 5 doesn't work. The idea of what best practices are for working for childcare, no one really knows. So we've been working a lot with our private employers as well as the city employees and non-for-profits about what can work, and spending a lot of time. And Pam makes a great point. It's not always about money. It's about expertise. And can we do this? And if we do, what is, how do we do it? And what we've heard really across the board is flexibility. Can we apply funds that we have? Yes, we need more. Or people hour or thought hours in innovative ways that go far beyond 9 to 5, or are not every day, but every other day. And working, again, the ARPA money has been very flexible. So we have a lot of little pilots going on. And I love the geniuses on the ground, because we've had a lot of those geniuses who are out here in Western Mass. I mean, it's always been the case. I mean, Western Mass is basically the Bilbo principle. I mean, Katie grew out here. It's always too little butter over too much bread. And, doing it just by population doesn't do us well, because Route 90 is straight, but once you get out here, there are a lot of hills and bumps and nooks and cranny, and it takes not well spent. But it is about consistency with flexibility, are like the two words we hear over and over again. And that's what we're trying to do on a local level, and have a lot of faith with this conversation today that this will become the norm in childcare.
No, I appreciate that. And go ahead, Nerys.
I add, I think the other piece of it too is that, and obviously you guys are AIM, right? So you have the audience of all these corporations in Massachusetts, but also thinking about compensation studies, right? When was the last time that your company did a compensation study? Who's getting paid what, right? And I think, the comment earlier was, in terms of communities of color and specifically women of color, have you gone back and checked? Are they, are folks getting paid what their counterparts are getting paid? And I think that, sometimes we let it ride and think it's okay. And I think the pandemic has taught us a lot. And, I would advocate for companies to go back and look at, their compensation, and specifically also thinking about upward mobility, promotions. I think all of us know and understand that sometimes, hiring within is great because we know the talent, but also thinking through what kind of trainings do we have for some of these entry level workers or mid managers who've been sitting there for years and have not been promoted. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
I think that's fantastic, and it's a good segue. So, we know this issue of racial disparities it's not exclusive to the childcare industry, right? And so you've sort of touched on that it gets involved in all workplaces. And so, Nerys, I know you just touched on one way to sort of work on that. I guess, Katie, can you share anything particularly that Alkermes is working on in the DE&I space around, again, trying to close some of these gaps, not just the gender gaps, but the racial gaps that exist, that are sort of keeping women from being able to be, moving up the ladder and be seen as equal to their male counterparts?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to answer that, Brooke. One thing I want to just add to that previous question, when I was on the Board of Early Education and Care, we had a number of decisions to make about whether or not we expand the number of childcare slots available, or do we shore up the workforce by making sure they were paid more adequately, still not totally adequately. And the board had a lot of conversation about that. And where we landed was we needed to shore up this workforce. We need to make sure that the people who are doing this critically important work with children, with anybody who needs care, are paid appropriately. And I think that is a place where funding is critically important, because it is a huge racial gap, it's a huge gender gap, and making sure that our caretakers are compensated is really important. In terms of what we're doing at Alkermes relative to DE&I, making sure that we have a diverse workforce is a of critical importance to the organization. We are partnering with the Partnership and the Mass Life Sciences Center, both of which have programs to help us make sure that we have diverse applicant pools, have programs to make sure that we have training opportunities for folks. In addition to that, we're looking at, or we are doing unconscious bias training within the organization to make sure that as we are looking, Nerys, to your point, our not just our hiring practices, but what are our promotion practices? Are they fair and equitable? We're looking at our job descriptions. Is there unconscious bias in the way that we even put our jobs out to the world? And how do we make sure that everybody who's reading these job descriptions can see themselves working within our organization? And so I'm really proud of the work that we've been doing, and we have more work to do. But I think coming together as a group, and Brooke and AIM, we've talked about this, as I have with other business groups, we're taking all information we can and any guidance that we can to make sure that we're doing all of the right things to diversify our business. It's the right thing to do from a society standpoint, but it's also the right thing to do for business. We know that businesses that are more diverse do better. Their stocks are better. Their reputation is better. It should drive people just because it's the right thing, but it's also the right thing for business.
Thank you, Katie. And I think you hit the nail on the head, and that's why the Pink Slip initiative for AIM has been so important, and why conversations like these are so important, to share best practices, to share experiences, to keep the dialogue going. So I appreciate that. I'm going to shift to another important issue that impacts these gender gaps in the workplace, right? The role of mentors and mentorships within the workforce. Mentoring and mentorships can be a great stimulus for change, but we also know that they're sort of delivered inequitably, right, between men and women. And we know it's incumbent on business leaders to really look at this issue when it comes to having conversations about advancing women in the workplace. So I guess, Nerys and Pam, and I don't care who goes first, how has mentoring impacted your career paths? And, what role and how important do you think this really is in sort of meeting some of these gender gaps?
Want to go first?
I'll jump in really quickly. Brooke, you hit on some points, right, in terms of even what's the inequities even in some of this, right? I would say I've been fortunate. I was a student athlete all through high school and through college, and I was able to meet mentors early in my career, right? Coaches and folks, but also my career here in Massachusetts. For me, it's been interesting. It's been men, right? I think in the beginning of my career, it was men who sort of mentored me, guided me, but also provided me some of the invisible playbook. As a young woman of color, I was sort of always the only Latina in the room, the only woman of color, in the room, and I was able to go through Conexión, go through the partnership, go through Lead Boston, go through Emerge, be part of all these organizations in Massachusetts that have allowed me to expand my network. But I've also been fortunate to be a mentor as well. And I think that, you have to pay it forward. You have to be able to have older mentors, young mentors. One of the things that I want to tell everyone on here is find youth who will mentor you. Right? I think we're always looking for the CEO or the head of HR. We're always looking for these, high mighty positions. No offense to anybody, but mentorship comes in so many different shapes and sizes. So I would really encourage folks to, find mentors out of their norm. But, I'll just say this quickly is there's mentorship and there's sponsorship. And I've been fortunate because if anybody knows me, I will show up to your house. If I want some mentorship, I will find you, I will track you down, I will buy you lunch, whatever it is. But there is an invisible playbook. And I think that's where the inequities happen because we don't know about them. No one teaches us, no one tells us. And if you're not part of certain circles, you're just not getting that information, right? Which then allows you to be able to see some of that upward mobility in your career. And we all know this, there's so many positions that are not posted. That only the folks within certain areas know about them. So I'm gonna pass it on because I could stay on this topic all day.
Pam, what are your thoughts?
I agree with everything that has been said. And I would just add that when you think about mentors, Think about people not only in your organization, but outside your organization. Don't forget those. When I think about internally and all the organizations I've been associated with, the mentors have been men primarily because of the industry. I was a CPA, so I worked for a big 4 firm. The majority of those at the time were men. And then I went to a big law firm. And in my particular group, which was tax, a lot of those were men. And then at Fidelity, I've seen more women. Obviously, we have a woman leader. There have been more women, but the managers of my particular groups have been men. But what was most pivotal in my career was the mentorship of a woman outside of Fidelity, and that was Benny Wiley, who was the very first executive director, president of the partnership. And I came to Boston 30 years ago from Texas, and I came here, I'm like, my gosh, where am I? It's so different between Boston and Texas. I didn't know anyone, and she took me under her wing and opened doors for me, introduced me to the various power brokers, got me on boards. I mean, I was in my 20s and I was on the BSO board. Like, how does that happen? It happened because of a woman, Benny Wiley. So I would just say, remember that you need to have mentors across the board, inside your organizations, and most importantly, outward, because they can be sponsors for you as well. And I agree with the difference between the mentor and sponsor. You need a combination of both, and you need people who look sometimes differently than you to help push you along.
Thanks, Pam. I appreciate it. We're running close to the end of our program, but I want to give the mayor the last word and last question. Politics is particularly male-dominated areas, we know, and I was just interested in if you could share a mentoring experience that really helped you as you sort of pursued this career.
I've been blessed with great mentors and mentees who have taught me so much. In politics, though, one that really stands out is actually a former Hoyoker. I'm sure Katie has heard the name before, Ann McHugh, who so long ago, when I was a kid, maybe before Katie was born, ran for mayor in Holyoke, and she was by far the best candidate. And she was outspoken, and she was also a mom of some young kids. And she won. I mean, she lost because of those children. And it was a horrible, horrible race that even when I was in elementary school and middle school, I remembered it. One of my prized possessions was one of her little round signs. And as I got older, I got to know her politically and working around different issues and whatnot. And she was just amazing. She was fearless. I mean, all of her elected hopes were dashed so long ago, and she would just tell me, you know, it's your choice. You know what they're going to do. It's your choice. Are you going to stand up again? You know, why are you doing this? Why would you have started this? It's like, you're not starting a war, you're finishing this battle, and we move on, let it go. And it was one of the biggest honors of my life, my political life, when I was elected mayor, and Anne had long since passed, as well as some of her children, and her sister came up and said, you did what Anne couldn't. You told them all to bleep themselves. That, you know, the McHugh family, that's kind of how we talk in Hoyoke, but somebody, regardless, and we did not agree politically at all. I mean, we were in the same party, and it didn't matter. She's like, no, there's not a lot of us. And still, I mean, and that was a 20-year difference between Ann McHugh and myself, and long before I thought of running for office. But I always, you know, I hold the fire of Ann McHugh in my heart. And she was, you know, she never said, oh, poor you. Oh, you've got a scratch or a bump. She was like, get the bleep up now or go home. Like, why are you here?
Yeah, and I think that's an important lesson, right? That sometimes as women, when we're looking to role models or leaders, it's how we measure success, or the people that have an imprint on us isn't maybe somebody else's definition of success, right? We can play a small role, we can have a mark. And so remembering that and incorporating that in all these conversations about mentorship and sponsorship is really important. I'm so sad that we're out of time. We could keep talking about this, I feel like, for another hour and gain so much expertise from you all. I cannot thank you enough, our esteemed panelists, for their thoughts and for sharing their personal experiences. They are fantastic. Thank you to Katie and Alkermes for their sponsorship of this event. Again, Pink Slip is a huge priority for AIM. Not just having these conversations, but then deriving action as a result. And so I want to thank all of you for what you're doing on the action front on the ground. You really are making a difference. I just want to let you all know, since we're in this virtual world now, if you're not familiar with my team, the government affairs team here at AIM, they're fantastic. We could not do what we do on behalf of members without them. Please, if you have issues or you would like to talk to us more about how you can become involved in what we've talked about today, please reach out to me or any of them. Certainly, you can also email our membership engagement team. We would love, if you're not a member, please reach out. We would love to make you a member and have you be part of all these fantastic conversations like the one we had today. I also want to flag 2 really great events that are coming up. We have our trade talk coming up on April 26th, talking about supply chain issues, very relevant for our businesses right now. And then, of course, our annual meeting, which I hope you can all attend on May 6th. With that, I'm going to let everybody go for the day. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Alkermes for making this possible. And please continue to be at the table and be involved both in your own businesses, but along with AIM as we continue to take this journey. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you, Brooke. Bye.
Thank you very much, Brooke.